Last time I told you about Cynthia Greer, the HOA president who parked her Escalade on the railroad tracks, had it destroyed by my locomotive, and then went back 6 weeks later in a rental car to take more photographs. Today, I am going to tell you what happened when she ran out of road. Because a person who cannot stop escalating eventually reaches a wall, and when they do, everything they built collapses at once. Stay with me. The railroad's internal safety review completed in mid-April, approximately 6 weeks after the incident. I received a copy of the findings through my union representative, and I read it with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting for it for a long time. The review confirmed that I had operated the locomotive within all applicable safety standards, that my emergency braking response had been initiated at the correct distance and in the correct sequence, and that the primary contributing factor to the incident was the presence of an unauthorized vehicle on the crossing surface. The signal fault was documented as a secondary contributing factor and was separately addressed in a maintenance report. The review also included a section I had not expected, but perhaps should have. Under the heading Community Safety Concerns and Third-Party Activities, the review documented the HOA's promotional activities regarding the turnout, including the Facebook posts, the community newsletter item, and the petition to the county. It cited the easement agreement language that Marcus had identified, and it noted that the railroad's legal department had been advised and was reviewing its options. I sent a copy to Marcus the same day. His response was a single line, "Now we move." The first step was a formal demand letter from Marcus to the HOA board. It was 13 pages long, and it documented, in precise legal language, the HOA's role in creating the conditions that led to the incident. It cited Cynthia's public promotion of parking at the crossing as a neighborhood amenity, the newsletter, the Facebook posts, the petition. It cited the easement agreement and the liability provision. It cited the documented pattern of the HOA operating outside its charter, including the unlawfully called board sessions, the bylaws amended without proper notice, and the fines assessed under provisions that did not exist at the time of the alleged violations. It demanded a full accounting of all fines levied in the previous 18 months, a return of all fines assessed under improperly enacted provisions, and it put the board on formal legal notice that the HOA's actions had contributed to a safety incident that resulted in the total destruction of a vehicle and had exposed residents to significant liability. The letter was sent to every board member individually by certified mail, so that each one received their own copy with their own signature required on the delivery receipt. I know how each of them reacted because I heard about it from Sandra, who had maintained quiet friendships with two of the board members who had never been entirely comfortable with Cynthia's direction but had lacked the will to oppose her. Both of them called Sandra within 24 hours of receiving the letter. Both of them said the same thing in different words. They said that they had not understood and that they were frightened and that they needed to talk. Sandra called me and said, "Daniel, I think you should come over." I went. James was there with his spreadsheet, which by this point ran to 714 line items covering every HOA action in 18 months, including dates, amounts, the bylaw provisions cited, whether that provision had existed at the time, and whether the required notice period had been observed. It was a remarkable document. James was a retired contractor who had built things his whole life and had a craftsman's attention to detail that he had turned, with quiet precision, toward documenting the dismantling of the community he lived in. Looking at that spreadsheet was like watching someone take something apart and lay every piece on a table so you could see exactly how it had been assembled. The two board members were named Richard and Carol. They were older, both retired, both had moved to the development for the quiet and the reasonable property taxes, and had ended up on the board because someone had to be, and they did not mind attending meetings. They had not understood what they were attending a meeting for until Cynthia had reshaped the board around her own purposes, and by the time they understood it, the momentum had been going long enough that stopping it felt like standing in front of a train. An irony I noted, but kept to myself. Richard and Carol were not villains. They were people who had made a series of small decisions to go along with something because opposing it seemed costly and complicated, and they had not added up those small decisions until a certified letter arrived from an attorney and the total became visible. I did not enjoy watching them understand what they had been part of, but I did not let that discomfort soften what needed to happen next. Marcus met with them the following week. He was, by his own description, not gentle, but he was fair. He explained their exposure clearly. Board members who vote on decisions that are later found to be outside the board's legal authority and who ignore documented warnings about those decisions can face personal liability in certain circumstances. The word personal, as it had been for Cynthia at a meeting many months ago in a different context, had a focusing effect. Richard and Carol retained their own attorney within the week, which was the correct decision and which Marcus had anticipated. The critical development, the one that restructured everything, came in the third week of May. The railroad's legal department filed a formal claim against the HOA under the easement agreement's liability provision. The claim was substantial. It covered the cost of the locomotive repairs, the cost of the crossing signal repair and upgrade that the incident had accelerated, the cost of the safety review itself, and the additional operational costs associated with the required post-incident certification procedures. It also included a demand for the removal of all HOA-published materials promoting the use of the easement area for parking or viewing, and a formal acknowledgement from the HOA that the turnout was not a community amenity and that unauthorized parking there was dangerous. The total figure was in the range of $80,000. I want to be precise about something here because the number matters less than what it represented. The HOA's reserve fund, which Sandra had access to through her historical records from Harold's time, held approximately $94,000. It had been built over years through careful stewardship and modest special assessments. Cynthia had spent a portion of it on her various aesthetic initiatives, the mandatory mailboxes, the approved paint color consultations, the wildlife signs that had appeared during a brief period when she had tried to ban bird feeders. The reserve was not what it had been. And a railroad claim of $80,000 plus Marcus's separate civil filing on behalf of the improperly fined residents, plus the legal fees the board was now accumulating, meant that the HOA was looking at potential liability that exceeded its reserves. The community meeting called to address this situation had a different energy than any meeting I had attended before. It was held on a Wednesday evening in late May, and this time Cynthia did not set the agenda. David, a board member who had been quietly building distance from Cynthia since the April letter arrived, called the meeting and took the podium. He was not a dramatic man. He was precise, and he was embarrassed in the specific way of someone who understands that their embarrassment is part of the price of what they allowed to happen. He presented the situation without spin: the railroad claim, the civil filing from Marcus on behalf of improperly fined residents, the legal fees, the reserve balance. He said that the board had received legal advice and that the advice was to settle as broadly and quickly as possible, that the alternative was litigation that the HOA almost certainly could not win and definitely could not afford. He said that several provisions enacted under the current administration had been found to be procedurally invalid and would need to be unwound. He said that the fines assessed under those provisions would need to be refunded. He did not say Cynthia's name during any of this. He did not have to. Cynthia was in the room. She was sitting in the third row on the left side, and I watched her face as David spoke. The expression she wore was one I recognized from the crossing, from the parking lot, from every meeting where I had raised a documented objection, and she had thanked me for my perspective. It was the expression of a person who was applying, with increasing desperation, a strategy that was no longer working. She was waiting for the moment where she could reframe what was happening as something she could control. That moment did not come. When David finished, there was a silence, and then Kevin Garcia, the young man whose car in his own driveway had been cited as an aesthetic blight, stood up. He did not make a speech. He simply said, I would like to make a motion for a vote of no confidence in the current board president. Sandra seconded it before he had finished the sentence. The vote was not close. The formal fallout unfolded over the following 2 months with the inevitability of a carefully documented legal process, which is what it was. The HOA reached a settlement with the railroad that consumed nearly all of the reserve fund and required the formal retraction of all materials promoting the crossing area. Marcus filed a separate civil action on behalf of 16 residents who had paid fines under improperly enacted provisions, and the HOA's insurance carrier, after reviewing the documentation, negotiated a settlement that included full refunds plus a modest sum for the aggravation, which is not a legal term, but which the carrier apparently calculated into their exposure anyway. Tom got a formal written apology from the board and a full refund of every fine he had ever paid. He framed the apology letter. He did not tell me this himself. His wife mentioned it at the block party later that summer, laughing, and I thought it was exactly the right thing to do. The Garcias were refunded and also given a formal acknowledgement that their moving boxes had not violated any validly enacted provision, which they said they appreciated even though they had long since unpacked. Kevin told me later that he had kept the original notice just to have it, an artifact of the specific absurdity that had greeted them when they moved in. Mrs. Patterson replanted her window boxes in whatever color she liked. She chose a deep orange that I think is quite striking. Nobody said anything about it. Cynthia's personal situation was more complicated. The railroad's claim had named the HOA as the party, not her individually, but the liability provision in the easement agreement left open the possibility of individual liability for the officer who had directed the promotional activities. Marcus had included this in his analysis, and the railroad's attorneys were aware of it. In the settlement negotiations, the question of whether to pursue Cynthia personally came up and was ultimately set aside in exchange for a broader HOA settlement and her formal resignation from all HOA positions. This was a pragmatic decision, not a merciful one. The HOA needed to settle and settle quickly, and the cleanest path to that required Cynthia to step down and allow the remaining board members to manage the process. She resigned on a Thursday afternoon. I know it was a Thursday because Tom texted me when he saw the email go out to the community list. He sent just the word and a period, and that was enough. What happened in the months after was quieter, but in many ways more significant than the dramatic collapse of the previous spring. Sandra agreed to serve as interim board president while a proper election was organized. James's spreadsheet became the basis for a full audit of HOA practices going back to Cynthia's first month. The audit identified 11 bylaw provisions that had been enacted without proper notice and procedure, all of which were formally voided and removed from the governing documents. The fine schedule was revised to match what Harold had originally set, with a provision that any changes required a community-wide vote, not just a board vote. The election was held in September. I ran for the board. Not for president, I did not want that, but for a seat on the committee overseeing infrastructure and safety, which was a committee that had not previously existed, and which Sandra created specifically because the crossing situation had made visible how completely the previous administration had ignored the physical realities of where the neighborhood was located. I was elected unopposed. The first thing I did in that role was contact the railroad's operations center and formalize a direct communication channel between the HOA and the rail company, not to petition for speed reductions or complain about noise, to establish a protocol where maintenance issues that affected the crossing could be reported directly and where the HOA would receive advance notice of any scheduled track work that might affect the Maplewood crossing signals. Frank, the supervisor I had first called a year and a half ago, was pleased. He had never had an HOA contact him proactively before. He said most of his interactions with neighborhood associations involved requests to silence trains. He appreciated, he said, finally talking to someone who understood what trains actually were. The gravel turnout got proper signage. Not from the HOA, which had no authority over the easement, but from the railroad, which did. It went up in October, clear and permanent, and it said what it had always needed to say. No parking, railroad property, authorized personnel only. I drove through Maplewood Crossing the first morning after the signs went up. It was an early shift, the light just coming over the eastern horizon, the air cold and sharp. I blew the standard horn signal at the quarter-mile mark, same as I always did. The crossing was clear. The gate came down on schedule, came back up as I passed, all systems functioning exactly as they were designed to function. I thought about Cynthia briefly, as I sometimes still do. I do not know where she went. The house sold quickly, listed in August, sold within 2 weeks. I saw a moving truck on a Saturday morning and noticed it was there, and by Sunday morning, the Escalade, the new one she had eventually replaced the rental with, was gone from the driveway. I did not watch it leave. I thought about the comment she had left on the Facebook post, the one where I had raised the safety concern, and she had said I was overstating risk due to professional bias. I thought about the handout she had brought to the community meeting with its bullet points and its carefully constructed language. I thought about that moment at the crossing when she had looked at an oncoming freight train and her first instinct had been irritation. Some people are not equipped for the information that the world is larger and more consequential than their plans for it. That is not a condemnation. It is just a fact that took me 2 years and a destroyed Escalade to fully appreciate. The tracks are still there. They will be there when everyone currently living in that neighborhood is gone. Freight moves on them every day, on schedule, at posted speed, operated by certified engineers who know their stopping distances. The crossing signal at Maplewood Drive has been upgraded and has not malfunctioned since. The turnout is clearly posted. The neighborhood is quieter now in the way that places get quiet when the thing that was generating noise is gone. I drove my westbound run this morning at 6:17. The crossing was clear. The light was good. I kept my hand near the horn cord the way I always do, out of habit, out of respect for a quarter-mile of physics that does not negotiate and does not forgive. Some things are just that simple.